It's a real pleasure to be here with friends old and new to discuss the economic and sanctions dimensions of the Iran deal as a complement to the discussions we had earlier this morning. So I will briefly introduce the rest of the panel. We've got Colin McGuinness, who's the Senior Democrat Policy Director on the Senate Banking Committee, Liz Rosenberg, Director of the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at CNAS, Caroline Herndl, who's the head of the Middle East team at the British Embassy in Washington, and Sean Thornton, formerly Chief Counsel at the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, and currently Chief Legal Advisor to Group Financial Security at BNP Paribas. So thank you all for coming. So I will very, very briefly, in the beginning of the discussion, just lay out the framework for sanctions relief that was described in the agreement reached last week, and then turn to our panelists for a discussion. So broadly, the agreement does sort of two things. It establishes two phases for relief. One on implementation day, which will, as Mr. Wolfsall said this morning, probably occur sometime early next year. And the second phase is transition day, which is 8 years from 90 days from yesterday. So roughly 8 years from now, assuming full compliance with the deal. And on implementation day, the United States will waive large portions of its secondary sanctions on Iran, will remove from its specially designated national list and other sanctions list a large number of Iranian persons and entities. And the EU will do the same. It will waive or relax many of its legal authorities and remove many people from its sanctions list. 8 years from now, the U.S. will terminate many of its legal authorities, and as will the EU, and both the EU and the U.S. will remove a further tranche of persons and entities from its sanctions list. And I think Caroline will help us clarify in a little bit exactly who will be removed and with whom transactions will be permitted and not. A few key points about both stages of relief. So both stages of relief apply only to nuclear-related sanctions. So sanctions applied against Iran for a wide range of other concerning behavior, counterterrorism, human rights abuses, provision of support to the regime in Syria, all of those will remain in place, with a few exceptions, most importantly for pistachios, caviar, and carpets. The restrictions that apply to U.S. persons will also remain in place. So by and large, unless activity is licensed by the government, American companies and businesses will not be able to engage in Iran. And so what emerges from this is a very, very complicated sanctions landscape with important strategic implications for the longevity and the viability of a deal. And so that's what I think we'll discuss this morning. And so I'll do so by turning first to Liz. Liz, you've written a fantastic piece in Foreign Affairs last week that kind of outlined some of these strategic risks and dynamics. So talk a little bit, if you can, about the kinds of risks that remain in Iran and the kinds of factors that will determine whether or not Iran receives the benefits that are contemplated in the JCPOA.
Sure. Thanks, Zach, and for the introduction. And on behalf of CNAS, because I wear that hat, I'm glad you're all here with us today. So the risks that still remain for companies or entities that would invest in Iran, there are a number of them. And just because this deal leans forward on an agreement and a kind of an opening for Iran commercially and diplomatically in the world, there's still quite a number of causes for reluctance, commercial reluctance on the part of those who would re-enter Iran. And as you just alluded to, that has a strategic significance. If Iran doesn't feel the benefit of this deal, it will feel as though the P5+1 is not making good on its side, which is concerning then for longevity of the deal. So why the reluctance? There are a couple of main categories here. One is concern about whether the deal will hold, whether Iran will cheat and there will be a reimposition of sanctions, in which case one's business investments there could fall apart and possibly be tied up in those sanctions. and that has reputational harm and, of course, commercial harm. Also, will spoilers, for example, there's a lot of attention on the U.S. Congress, will other outside actors come and try and undermine the deal in some way, which would then again potentially see foreign investors get tied up in reputational or commercial harm. Also, concerns about the business climate. So Iran may have a good deal of work to do to improve financial systems integrity. They've received a pretty poor grade by the international technical standard-setting body, the Financial Action Task Force, on a number of those scores. And there's been a concerning history of corruption, particularly associated with the Ahmadinejad era, that they'll need to move beyond in order to give foreign investors the confidence to move in there. Also, of course, even in this rosy scenario for nuclear diplomacy, there's still a lot of sanctions that will remain on Iran. In the EU, in the United States, and at the UN too, past implementation day, of course, those have to do with areas not germane to this agreement, excuse me, such as human rights, regional destabilization. So those remain in place, and also the restrictions that bar U.S. companies from being involved creates a web surrounding the potential business involvement in Iran that every foreign company must navigate to try and figure out how to make its inroad there. And finally, I would just flag another big concern or a reason for reluctance for foreign investors is how U.S. law enforcement will look at this deal and activity in commercial activity in Iran. So we have strong signals from policymakers about how they would like to see the future engagement with Iran going forward, but we don't have press releases from the Department of Justice or the New York Department of Financial Services indicating how they plan to look upon accidental or intentional violations of sanctions going forward. So that's another area of great concern for big banks and companies who've seen a record of very expensive, reputationally damaging big bank settlement cases in the last several years. As to why it's important that this occur, we've said of course, Iran needs to see the benefit of its bargain in order to move forward. And beyond that, I think there's good strategic reason for the P5+1 and indeed the entire international community to want to see Iran be able to develop commercially, economically, improve financial system transparency, which may be a byproduct of dollar diplomacy, if you will. And also, I will just note and close that it may give the United States and the EU greater economic leverage later with Iran to see greater economic integration between these economies, which is a kind of, if you are a hawk or a skeptic, useful insurance policy on future policy down the road with Iran.
So let's talk just briefly, and then Colin, I'd like to pick up on Liz's allusion to the congressional review period, but let's talk briefly about one specific area, and that is the energy sector. Yeah. So what is Iran likely to seek, and what is it likely to obtain in terms of relationships with the global, the sort of energy giants, given that these are companies that are often used to dealing with risky, dicey, difficult parts of the world?
So the reason why it's useful to talk about energy companies in particular, of course, is because Iran has world-class oil and gas reserves. It's an incredibly strategic commodity for its economy, for its revenue base, and indeed for the kind of economic reform it would like to support. It needs this, it needs that revenue, it needs an expansion of production in the oil and gas sector. And in order to really take it to the next level and regain certainly the kind of, well, it may be able to regain production levels independently that it was at right before those most punishing sanctions were imposed in late 2011, 2012. But to really take it to the next level and add another million barrels or more to that, it needs the kind of technical assistance and support and partnership that you get from partnering with a sophisticated international oil company that has the experience and expertise on use of technology, on process management, supply chain management, and you've seen in the past when it has partnered with some of those last companies standing, Chinese companies, for example, in Iran under these sanctions, it has not been able to ramp up independently its oil and gas production, partly because of the sanctions, of course, and also because of technical challenges that these companies have. That's one of the reasons why Iran would like to partner with European companies in particular, Western companies more broadly. They have relationships with European companies, more recent than American companies, of course. And in this history, there's a lot of knowledge, that's already existing knowledge about reservoirs and techniques suitable for specific plays, if you will. So whether they are able to entice those companies in, I think there's a lot of interest on all sides, but that depends on the kind of contract provisions that they lay out, and that's still certainly a work in progress. Also, those foreign companies will be careful not to hit go before implementation day for the reasons that we were just discussing about reluctance to harm one's reputation or violate sanctions in this environment.
Great, thanks. That's fantastic and very, very interesting set of dynamics, Liz. So before we hit go on implementation day, we have to hit adoption day. And Colin, I wonder if you could illuminate for us the administration transmitted on Sunday to Congress the deal for the statutorily mandated review period. So talk a little bit for us about what that review period is likely to look like. What is Congress or the Senate specifically likely to focus on? And what might the dynamic between the administration and Congress look like over the next 2 months?
Well, thanks, Zach, and thanks for having me. It's a delight to be here. I've learned a lot already. I think that it's important to emphasize that we're at a very early stage, that the documents were formally conveyed to Congress only on Sunday, and that there is this 60-day review period. Secretary Moniz, Secretary Kerry, Secretary Lew, and others are coming before Congress for an all-senators briefing and an all-House members briefing this week. And the National Security Committees that deal with these issues, banking, foreign relations, armed services, intelligence, and the like, will all be holding a series of hearings over the course of the next few weeks, and then perhaps in September in anticipation of a vote. But I think it's important to recognize that, ironically, much of the focus so far is on a set of issues outside of the scope of the agreement. And David has alluded to this, Suzanne did, John talked about it at some length at the outset. I think it's important to keep in mind that the focus of the agreement and its goal was to ensure that Iran could not develop a nuclear weapon. And that is also the focus of the very tough and comprehensive sanctions regime that Congress and the Obama administration have put in place over the course of the last 7 or 8 years. That people sometimes, given all the rhetoric around the deal and the regional security implications of the deal, forget that sanctions are not an end in themselves. They are a means to an end, and that end was to bring the Iranians to the table and to force them to negotiate an agreement like the one that has been negotiated thus far. I think Congress's focus will be very broad and hopefully very deep, and it will be the full gamut of issues that John talked about that are contemplated by the agreement. And they include the enrichment limitations, the enrichment R&D, the stockpile limitations, the changes to the Iraq reactor, the transparency and verification pieces of the agreement, including through the entire fuel cycle. I think it's very important that people assess and make kind of prudential judgments about in some ways, the genius of the fuel cycle limitations. And they've been alluded to obliquely earlier, but I think it's important to recognize that the purpose of having a monitoring and verification scheme that covers the whole fuel cycle is that it not only prevents Iran from taking untoward steps at their declared sites and within the mines and the mills and the uranium processing facilities and all the rest, all of which we have eyes on, but it is also designed to prevent a covert or a sneak out kind of an approach on Iran's behalf. Because if you know all of the inputs into that process and can monitor it all the way along, you can also then make judgments if there are discrepancies in terms of the outputs. And that's an important piece of the process that we haven't talked about yet. I think Congress will also want to look at the relationship between that fuel cycle monitoring process and the conversion from a procurement ban to a procurement channel. And people have talked a little bit about the implications of that, but that coupled with the fuel cycle piece is very important. I think the sanctions relief piece, its sequencing and phasing, and the obligations of Iran to comply with the whole set of obligations over the course of the next, whatever it is, 6 to 12 months is going to be very important. I think the ballistic missile and the conventional arms embargo, which has already been a focus of some critics, will be an important focus of congressional hearings and the like. And the dispute resolution mechanism that people have already talked about a little bit. All of those will be a focus of Congress's assessment. But I do think members will also look at the degree to which, and this has also been alluded to by earlier panels, the degree to which there's a willingness on the part of the administration to embed the agreement in a broader regional security strategy which deters Iran from the kind of malign support for terrorism, human rights abuse, and the like. And there are all kinds of legal authorities that the administration has, notwithstanding the relief that they provide in the context of the deal, to do that.
Interesting. Just talk a little bit about what the legislative options for Congress might be at the end of the review period. So it can vote all kinds of different resolutions. Maybe just explain a little bit what each of those options might look like.
So the Congressional Review Act, developed by Senator Cardin and Senator Corker, provides for basically explicitly two options in terms of resolutions. A resolution of approval or a resolution of disapproval within the 60-day review period. A third option, which doesn't require a resolution, is that Congress holds hearings, maybe adopts hortatory resolutions or other kind of side legislation, but doesn't act on a resolution with respect to the agreement itself. I think those are the three most likely options. Depending on how that plays out and whether Congress rejects the deal or not, and then presumably the president vetoes a resolution of disapproval, and the debate rages about whether he can persuade members not to override the veto, then there are also kind of ancillary steps that deal opponents might take subsequent to that. They could include new sanctions legislation, which presumably in that circumstance would also be vetoed. They could include appropriations limitations. There are a host of other possibilities, I think, that opponents might have going forward.
Great. Thank you. Carolyn, I want to turn to you, and I'm going to ask two questions, although I'll do it one at a time. One is to just talk a little bit about what the EU landscape is likely to look like. So we've all, or several of us, have sort of identified the fact that sanctions on U.S. companies are, for now at least, in place. And Colin, we can return to how persistent that restriction might be if there is a sustained period of compliance with the agreement. But EU companies, sometime early next year, are likely to be able to resume commercial ties with Iran. So if you could talk a little bit about how they're likely to assess some of the risks that Liz identified, and what the approach of various EU governments, obviously the British government in particular, is likely to be in terms of encouraging businesses to engage with Iran so that it receives the benefits of its bargain and adheres to the terms of the agreement, or instead highlights some of the risks related to support for counterterrorism, anti-money laundering concerns, and the like.
Sure. And first off, thank you for having me as well. It's really great to be here. In terms of the appetite, the business climate in Europe, I think I'd describe it as sort of cautious interest, and it very much varies from sector to sector. There are interests among businesses that have, in fairly recent past, done business with Iran. Obviously, we haven't got quite the same history of trade embargoes in Europe as there is here in the US. So there are businesses and companies that have an interest in going back into Iran or establishing new commercial ties with Iran. I think it's quite important to look very carefully, though, at the financial sector. The banks are some of those that have been hit hardest by fines, including when they have been deemed to contravene US secondary sanctions. So that sector in particular, I think, is extremely cautious across Europe, but obviously for us, particularly in the UK, about what is going to be possible in terms of, and what is going to be permissible under the new sanctions regime as it's adjusted as part of this deal. Before I sort of skip on to the next part of your question in terms of what the UK is doing to work with businesses, I think it's worth just highlighting again a couple of the comments that have been made by Liz and Colin and others throughout the morning, that this was a deal made by two sides, and the monitoring and verification processes that have been set out, the really stringent transparency mechanisms are there so we can make sure with absolute clarity that Iran is keeping to its side of the bargain. But as Liz said, Iran will be looking to us to do the same. And the reason this is important is that there are lots of people, lots of bodies in Iran that will be looking to cry foul and claim that, see, we told you, we can never trust the West. They never keep their promises. They won't comply with this deal. And then if we get to that stage and Iran feels that it isn't getting the benefit of the deal and that we have disengaged or reneged on our terms, then the deal will be dead in the water, and that's a genuine risk. So in terms of what we're doing, the UK government's approach to businesses and banks is based in that context. We're not urging them to rush back in. What we're trying to do is help businesses and banks understand what the new sanctions, what is being lifted and what's not. The other thing to make clear is at the moment we're saying nothing has been lifted yet. So again, sort of not urging to rush in, but there are opportunities. So we're working with those businesses and banks to help them understand both EU sanctions and actually also, again, the complex web of US sanctions that will remain. As I said, a lot of the banks are very concerned still that they wouldn't inadvertently trip US sanctions. We've just started doing that. I think throughout the course of this negotiation, the UK has been very keen to urge companies not to think that this is a free-for-all and be rushing back in. And again, for all the reasons that Liz set out in terms of sanctions are the only risk of doing business with Iran. So I think we're trying to work constructively with businesses to help them understand where the opportunities are so that Iran does feel the benefit, but also help them understand how to navigate these other risks.
Thank you. So I may actually turn to Sean for a moment first. So Sean, you spent many years as the top sanctions lawyer in the US government. The US government's position is slightly different from that of the British government and the European governments, again, because most US businesses won't be able to re-engage. Nonetheless, the approach that the US government takes to sanctions enforcement and to clarifying the scope of what is within the terms of the agreement and was not will be very, very important here and globally. So maybe talk a little bit about the tools that the US government has on its own and in concert with some of its partners to communicate with the private sector, to draw clear lines about what's in and what's out.
Sure. Thank you very much, Zach. And if I may clarify,
Please.
I am speaking entirely in a personal capacity today and not on behalf of my current or previous employers.
Absolutely.
My view on that, Zach, is OFAC and the State Department and broader parts of the U.S. government really could do a much better job of providing clarity to the U.S. public in terms of what's permitted and what's prohibited. And I think the biggest enemy of clarity is the conditions that, that are often attached to lifting sanctions. For example, when sanctions were relaxed with respect to Burma several years ago, they weren't really relaxed. I mean, they were relaxed, but new investment was allowed in Burma subject to a variety of conditions, reporting requirements, can't interact with anybody who's still on the OFAC list, and experience quickly proved a large number of influential businessmen and businesses remained on the OFAC list. It was hard to find a landlord in Burma who wasn't, somehow connected to the OFAC list. And if you were successful, you had to file these reports that were made public with the State Department about your internal compliance programs and corporate social responsibility. Those were all worthy objectives, I think, but the cumulative effect of that was to create a lot of uncertainty, because in the enforcement environment that Liz and others have mentioned, you want to get it right. You don't want to make a mistake. I think OFAC does issue regulations and they put FAQs on the website, but I don't think if the idea is to encourage more engagement, I don't think the public needs more information. I think they need fewer conditions and simpler indications of what's permitted and what isn't.
Interesting, thank you. So Caroline, the second question I wanted to ask, I think in some ways builds on both Sean and Colin's interventions, and that is about what happens if the deal in some respects starts to unravel because Iran doesn't get the benefit of its bargain, or because Congress votes some measure of disapproval. So there's a world in which, or there's a narrative at least, that if the U.S. doesn't perceive that the deal or the verification measures are going as intended, unilaterally, just as we imposed secondary sanctions in the last several years, that the U.S. government can reimpose sanctions that will force Iranian adherence, or that can reimpose sort of the situation that prevailed over the last several years. From the perspective of a close ally and a partner government, does the U.S. government have that ability? What are the limitations on the U.S. government's ability to, with unilateral sanctions, impose further pressure in the context of the current situation?
Sure. I think it's worth bearing in mind that whilst the US secondary sanctions were, I guess, a US unilateral move, they were still adhered to by the rest of the international community. It did take international unity to enforce this incredibly comprehensive sanctions regime. And at the same time as you were seeing US sanctions be put in place here in terms of secondary sanctions, we were actually working very closely with the US in the EU to impose European sanctions to build that overarching comprehensive sanctions regime. If the US, either at the behest of Congress, were to withdraw from the deal, I think maintaining that unity would be extremely difficult. And I think there are two problems. One is just it has cost European countries, others, it has cost them economically to adhere to these sanctions. But obviously, everyone was willing to do so. I think our Chancellor of the Exchequer was at one point explicitly asked the question, is it worth it in terms of trying to curtail Iran's nuclear program? And the obvious answer is yes. So it would be incredibly difficult to persuade the rest of the P5+1 and the wider international community that have to adhere to these sanctions that it is still worth it if we've spent 2 years just in this negotiation process, but even longer in the broader negotiation process. To get to this point, we have a deal where London, Moscow, Paris, Beijing, Berlin all believe that this is a deal that's in our national security interests, that we think is good enough. If the US were the country to cause that to fall apart, I think it would be very difficult to bring Iran back to the table. I think the idea that we could bring Iran back to the table and just say, okay, so that deal we negotiated, actually we want more. It's not a realistic prospect. And so I think the idea that the US could unilaterally impose new sanctions that the rest of the international community would then adhere to is very questionable, I think.
Interesting, thank you. A very important, I think, intervention over the next 2 months. We've got a couple of minutes before we open it up to the audience, and I wanted to direct the last question to Colin. We've all discussed U.S. businesses will be barred, for the most part, from doing reestablishing commercial ties to Iran over the next, for the foreseeable future. Assuming everything goes well in the next 2, 3, 5 years, do you anticipate, and by well I mean Iran adheres to the monitoring and verification procedures that are outlined in the deal, European companies re-engage with some measure of success in a wide range of commercial fields, oil trade, et cetera. Do you anticipate pressure from American companies to be able to re-enter the Iranian market to compete more effectively against some of their European or Asian counterparts?
I think, Zach, there'll be some of that, but I suspect that at least Congress will be focused over the course of the next 2, 3, 4 years on ensuring scrupulous compliance to the deal. And that the question then before Congress will be, at what point might Congress be willing to terminate the sanctions that it has imposed by law, as distinguished from those that are imposed by executive order or other administrative action. And I think the focus of Congress over the course, assuming that the deal is not disapproved and moves forward in the scenario you described, will be on ensuring compliance and making certain prudential judgments about what sanctions ought to be lifted permanently and at what point.
Great, thank you very much. So I think we've got microphones floating around. If you've got questions, please raise your hand. I think we'll do our best to get you a microphone so you can be heard. Sure, in the blue in the front here.
Thank you. I'm Nicole Uehara from Sojas Corporation. I just wondered, under the case of a snapback on sanctions, would there be any sort of grandfathering clause for any of these non-U.S. companies that have gone in to do any business deals with Iran? Thank you.
One for me? I mean, I think it will depend, and others are more expert than me on sort of how these contracts are negotiated. I think what's worth remembering is that in the last 10 years, when EU sanctions have been applied, there has been willingness to take the hit. That companies that already have contracts, that are already doing business with Iran, they would have to work out what that meant for them. And that there was willingness on the part of the EU, at least, to take forward those sanctions, even though that ties actually already existed. So I don't think I have the exact answer to your question, but what I'd say is on past experience, I don't believe that if we're a couple of years in and there are existing contracts and existing ties, if we see Iran reneging on its part of the deal, that won't cause us to hesitate in moving towards pushing Iran back towards compliance, either through snapback of sanctions or other measures.